have this conversation, Julie. I'm so glad that you could join. And
Thank
so
you for
glad
having
you joined
me.
the boat. Yeah, it should be super to get to delve into women's leadership and gender and
We might
all.
as well. I
Yeah,
know. Seeing that we're all sort of hunkered down anyway, we might as well have this conversation.
that's right. Yeah. And I think it really helps to have business as normal to the extent that we can. And we're really lucky to be able to do so. So, yeah, for sure.
The brilliant thing about doing all of this VCing, and I mean, we're sort of lucky, that we can still do it. So.
Yeah. Very lucky. Very true. Great. So welcome to Emtrain's Always Learning. I'm Laraine McKinnon. I'm a talent and culture strategist with Emtrain. And our guest today is Julie Desjardins. So Julie and I actually live about 15 minutes away from each other here in Silicon Valley. But today is day one of the local shelter-in-place decree because of the coronavirus pandemic. So we're each coming to you from our home offices, and John and Sonia and Hastina, who manage the broadcast and our marketing efforts, are all also safely at home. And we know we're really lucky to be able to have this conversation like in the normal course of business, and that it's really, really difficult for a lot of other people. And from our research, we know that empathy and social intelligence and those awareness skills are really important for the psychological health of a community. So we want to encourage you, to have empathy for others, to realize that everyone's circumstances are really different, to give yourself a break, give others a break, and wash your hands and stay home if you possibly can. So with that important note, I want to introduce Julie Desjardins. So Julie is an author, an academic. She was most recently a strategic partner at Facebook and is currently the Senior VP of Gender Education and Diversity at Credas, which is a management consulting company. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you for having me, Laraine. I'm so glad we can do this.
Yeah, me too. So one of the things I thought we'd start off with, you were a history professor at Baruch College in New York. You've taught at Harvard. You moved here from the East Coast. You took a role at Facebook, and now you consult with companies here. So what are your observations of Silicon Valley?
It's a little bit surreal because I never in a million years thought that I was going to be working at a Silicon Valley company, given my background. But I have to tell you, so I moved here from New York about 3.5 years ago. And obviously, as a history professor, my focus has always been women and gender. So everything I've written, everything I've researched has always been around women and gender. And then I was going to this place, sort of the mecca of innovation, where I thought, there is going to be no use for me here because, of course, everybody's innovative. Everybody's innovating, looking forward, not looking backwards. I look backwards for a living. And so my other presumption was that everybody is just going to be a little bit further ahead in terms of gender in the workplace. Because everyone talks a very good game here and they sound very innovative in all things. And I assume that also meant people ops, And I move here, and every woman in tech that I came across had this crazy story to tell, about how things were not exactly so innovative when it came to, dealing with gender issues in the workplace. And that's when I realized that maybe even someone like me who studies the past had something to say, because, I study culture in the workplace. That's what I've studied historically. And what I realized is that there's cultural origins for what's going on in the workplace, in tech, in Silicon Valley. And unfortunately, I feel like we're not having those conversations to sort of remind people what it is. I mean, what's going on on Wall Street, or what's going on in legal offices. It's very similar gender dynamics, but I find that in Silicon Valley, it's just kind of dressed up in this innovative garb. And so, but it's still the same masculinist kind of culture. It just looks different. And so, and it looks less imposing because it looks very informal. Oftentimes the manager is dressed in a hoodie And it doesn't look like it's adhering to those same social rules that we see in much more sort of traditional corporate culture, right? And so I think we're sort of trapped into this idea that like, oh, it's much looser and this is better for women. And because it's, new and changing every day, women have an ability to sort of jump in and be able to have traction here like they wouldn't be able to in a much more sort of established, kind of field. But in fact, many of the same dynamics are the same. They're the same. They just don't look the same as what we're used to in other fields and in other, corporate cultures, but they're there.
So even if it's a meritocracy and anybody should be able to fit right in, there's still a lot of these signals of cultures and social norms that exist that aren't as open and equal and inviting and inclusive to others, right?
There's this real mythology of meritocracy in Silicon Valley. And it's not to say that people from nowhere can have this amazing kernel of idea that gets, sort of becomes something in Silicon Valley. It's very much like historically the Trek West, when people, came and they had nothing more but an idea and hope. And that mythology, there's truth to it. But there's also, even, back when people came west, for the gold rush in the 1850s, there was a very masculinist mythology too, right? And it's amazing how the way that we sort of imagine Silicon Valley brilliance and, people who just come up with these sort of like ideas in a moment and build them up. This is a very masculine mythology. And there's ways in which we don't imagine women having that same kind of virtuosity.
Yeah, I'm thinking Go West, young man, right? It was all about going and finding your fortune and getting those opportunities. So, you see history repeat all the time. I know, I'm sure. I first heard of you before I got to meet you and be friends with you because you wrote the Madame Curie complex.
Yes.
So,
yes.
I'd love, you've got all this like knowledge around history and this really interesting way of connecting it with what's happening in the current world. Like shift us a little bit into science and technology, engineering and math. Of course, Silicon Valley is a place, but it's also sort of a theme, a concept around STEM. So, tell us what that means, what you see there.
I want to thank you, Laraine, for sort of appreciating that there's something that somebody who studies the past has to say that's relevant in the present. Because I think that the assumption is that like it's got nothing to help us with now. It's always a little bit dodgy to say that people, study the past so that they won't make the exact same mistake in the present and future, because of course the conditions are not the same. We had a flu epidemic in 1917. It is not the same as coronavirus. The factors are different, but there's lessons to be learned, right? We can compare. And so what I try to do is I look at things going on in the past and I try to put them in conversation with the present. And so every sort of book that I've written, every woman that I've studied, I've chosen them because they have something to say. They have a conversation to have with what's going on in the present. And so in the Madame Curie complex, every single woman scientist that I wrote about had something to say about a current dynamic that we see in science. And unfortunately, those dynamics are still very much there. And I felt like their stories resonate with women in science and tech today. As you know, I wrote a book on Lillian Gilbreth. We've talked about this. For anyone who doesn't know who Lillian Gilbreth is, she was an industrial psychologist at the turn of the century, got a PhD in industrial psychology, when no women were getting PhDs in anything at the time. She's of Cheaper by the Dozen fame, okay? And she, if anyone has read the books or seen the movies Cheaper by the Dozen, she had a dozen children. And the reason why I retrieved her is because she had a totally fascinating conversation that, to have in the present about work-life balance. And God knows no one was calling it work-life balance in 1915 when she was getting her PhD. And please know that her quote unquote balance is not one I would recommend. I'm exhausted when I think about what she did. But she had this conversation about women having a professional life and a personal life on their terms. that I thought was so important for women in the here and now that I had to write about her. She also was one of these women in STEM because she was an industrial engineer. And so each of the people that I write about, I think, add to this conversation. And I'm sort of obsessed with work-life balance, women in professional cultures, gender in professional cultures. I also happen to write about the guy who was the father of American football, to talk about the crisis in American masculinity. So, I'm equal opportunity.
Yeah.
But, this latest book that I've done on Lillian Gilbert, on Missy Meloney.
Yeah.
I know no one has heard of Missy Meloney until now because she very intentionally did everything she did in obscurity. But the way that book came about was when I was researching all of these other people to talk about women in STEM fields or whatever, to talk about American masculinity through football, to talk about this industrial psychologist. Missy popped up every single time when I was researching these other people. And I thought, who on earth had a reach in all of these different theaters, of
Give us a time frame. Give us a time frame for her.
Part of the century. So she was really, most busy from, say, like 1900 to about 1943.
Okay.
She died in 1943. And what was remarkable was the way that I first sort of, met Missy was when I was researching the Madame Curie complex. She was the American benefactress to Madame Curie. When no one was giving money to Madame Curie, Missy Meloney pulled off the most successful PR campaign to literally raise in weeks well over the $120,000 she needed to get a gram of radium to do her research. No one was paying Madame Curie to do her research because she was a widow. Okay. And so at that point, the scientific establishment had sort of been done with her. And Missy raised all of this money to advance a woman scientist at the turn of the 20th century. It's remarkable because this is a period when literally womanhood and science are being defined as antithetical.
Talk a little bit more about that.
So, one of the things that I write a lot about is the history of professionalization of any field, but mainly science fields. And the one way that when you're trying to professionalize a field, you're trying to infuse it with legitimacy and prestige. And in our culture, the best way to do that is to infuse it with all sorts of masculine connotations, right? Yeah. This, by the way, is exactly why we still have a very masculinist culture now in Silicon Valley. The way that you get sort of legitimacy is to insert all of this masculine connotation into what you're doing and defining your field, right?
Yeah, we see a lot of this in the unconscious bias work, right? So if you are taking the Harvard IAT test, you can actually look at images. You can see images of women in science, images of men in science, and you get these biases towards the men in science. We see it in the way scientific publications list their authors, who gets credit or more credit for scientific publications. There's just so many really tangible pieces of data in the research that's been done around gender and science, which you had mentioned that Margaret Mead, I think, had done this work on women in science 60 years ago or something.
You guys at Emtrain have amassed all of this amazing data to prove what I was trying to sort of prove with my research, which is much more, I guess the evidence is, where yours is empirical and data, mine's more sort of discursive, but Margaret Mead in the 1950s, she and another social scientist named Rhoda Mitro were trying to understand how Americans, sort of their attitudes about scientists. And so she would have high school students draw their version of a scientist. And the vast majority of these students, of course, in the 1950s drew a male figure in a lab coat, bespectacled, bearded, right?
Wearing the tie.
Wearing a tie. No one was imagining this in a female mold, right? And it's not the same image that we would draw today. If you would say, draw a guy in tech, right? Now they would draw the guy with a hoodie, but it's still a male figure. And that's because the way that these fields in science and tech have gained legitimacy in our culture. Obviously, they've gained legitimacy just because we all use the tech and it's so important in our daily lives. But also the way that these fields have gained prestige is to be infused with all of this masculine connotation. And so we do imagine, I call it scienticity, which is the ability to think and be and act techie and scientific. We imagine that in our minds still as masculine to the core. Whether it's the scientist, the atomic physicist in the post-war era, or it's the techie now. I think it's still very much a masculine figure.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, part of this also sort of redefines the expectations for women in the workplace. So you've got these external social, historical social norms about what's expected of women, and then you come into the workplace and some of these norms carry over, or they create an awkward situation within the organization when women are expected to do certain things, but they're, there as, full employees with brilliant minds working on these scientific and technology discoveries. I remember you saying that Lillian Gilbreth, whom you wrote about, won both Engineer of the Year and Mother of the Year in the same year, which is crazy, but I feel like that's what's expected of women in the workplace these days.
Well, and to be honest, this is also what I call the Madame Curie complex. The way that Missy raised money for Madame Curie, made Americans like her enough to write these checks on her behalf.
Yeah,
she had to convince Americans that they weren't writing checks to a scientist. They were writing checks to this humanitarian saint who just happened to be using science to rid humanity of cancer, like any good mother, of course, would want to do, right? And so that's why she really discovered radium. She's not really a scientist, people. And that's how she got people to write the checks. So the expectation was that she was this sort of Mother of the Year. And it's hilarious because Missy Meloney portrayed Curie in the press as this sort of Mother of the Year. Man, she was not that. Okay. And I'm not, I hate being honest about this because I don't want to attach judgment to this, but she was not Mother of the Year.
Yeah. Meloney wasn't.
Well, Missy Meloney actually was more so than Curie, though. Yeah, Missy Meloney had one child and was a professional, but Curie literally had her daughters raised by her father-in-law so that she could go back to the lab at all times. It was all about the science. But she couldn't look that myopic. The male scientists are supposed to look that singularly.
Right, that's expected of the male scientist. Somebody else, raises the kids. They dip in every once in a while, but not.
Well, and actually, if you actually look at the studies, there was a great study in 1963 done by a woman named Anne Rowe called Becoming a Scientist. She was trying to understand how the Nobel Prize winning scientists became who they became. And one of the things she did, she went to all of these Nobel Prize winners and she kind of created a sort of portrait of what those people are, sort of a psychological profile. And she decided that there were all these things that in our culture we decide are male traits. Hyper-focused, myopic, antisocial, and actually necessarily antisocial because if they're overly social, that means they're subjective, which makes them bad scientists. So, girls being culturally appropriate girls, the ones who play with tea sets as opposed to playing with gadgets and pulling them apart. The makings of a scientist was some kid who was much more self-sufficient, played by himself, gadgeteering and all that. They also decided that was, of course, a male child or an appropriately male child,
So I think, Julie, your research, though, has shown that, these women were really effective in times where all society or most of society believed that women had to act and behave a certain way. And we've come, many, many decades later, centuries in some cases for your historical figures. And And a lot of those traits that made those women really successful in a really overtly biased society are still really effective today. And so, what do we know from history, and how are women in particular able to take some of those more effective skills? At Emtrain, we've done a lot of research lately on unconscious bias, on social intelligence, on power dynamics in the workplace. And we're starting to see how they can either create healthy workplace cultures or really erode the workplace culture. And so what have you found that's been consistent over, so many years and where society's evolved? Like, what do you recommend for people today?
Can I go back to that Ann Rose study? Because it's exactly the point. One of the things that she decided was that good scientists were antisocial and didn't necessarily have what you and I would now call soft skills.
Yeah.
The research now tells us that, of course, the most successful teams are the ones that have people with soft skills on them, and that they're relational, and that they're very good, cultivating relationships on a team. And there's been this fiction for a very long time that science and tech does not require those soft skills, right? And that, a successful Nobel Prize winning scientist didn't, collaborate with other people. He just had this light bulb idea unto himself.
Right.
We know that science doesn't happen that way. Innovation doesn't actually happen that way. You actually have to have very good people skills to draw those ideas out in people and to be able to brainstorm these ideas together and to collaborate. That's how innovation really happens. And it just happens to be, I don't want to essentialize this, but it does happen to be that women have been socialized to be better at those things. We know statistically that women they have better soft skills. For whatever the reason is, some people will insist it's because they biologically are inclined to, and I'm not going to say that. I think that given women social location, they have learned to get good and to strategize these ways, right?
I agree.
Absolutely. And so I think what happens, all the social science tells us that actually those culturally feminine traits, not essentially female traits, but culturally feminine traits, tending to relationships, listening, good communication skills, all of these things are the makings of a good leader and a very, very effective leader, whether it's a manager on a team or whether it's in politics, whatever it happens to be. And yet we still imagine an effective leader as, again, this culturally masculine figure. An individual who's sort of a standout, right? And doesn't necessarily play well with others. Maybe a little bit narcissistic, but that's okay because he's charming and charismatic.
Yeah, it's so brilliant that things get.
But that's not actually how things get done. You need the kismet of the team, and women are very good at greasing that machine. Historically, I'm not saying that women can't be brilliant individuals. They can be.
Of course.
But anyway, being effective this way, this is a culturally feminine way of being. So.
Yeah, and our research is starting to play out on this too. So, we have done a major research study, 2.5 million data points, 125 plus companies, 40,000 plus employees, and we're looking at employee sentiment. So, about your own behaviors, the behaviors of your colleagues and your team and your managers and your management, and we've absolutely seen, the need for collaboration, the need for respect, the need for appreciating other people's circumstances, these in-groups and out-groups. And I think we're finally getting to the point where we will have some of the data to prove a lot of these points, which will help people shift from that persona that's really persisted for such a long time into the much more modern leader. So
I appreciate what you're doing at Emtrain, because I feel like it's very hard to get to these cultural dynamics statistically, and I think you're asking the right questions to get to this data that you've accrued is really great cultural data, which is not easy. It's very easy to be able to sort of count the women in the room or whatever, but it's very hard to get to these cultural attitudes. So you guys have done an amazing job.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And it was so interesting to me to get to hear that you've observed these things through history, that you've been working on workplace culture for over 20 years, when for a lot of folks, it's a much newer concept. So we're so glad that you joined us today. Thank you for A, being here, B, sharing your expertise and your talents, and C, being really flexible to be able to join us virtually from home, given the circumstances.
Yeah, thank you for letting me sort of roll out of bed and turn on the computer.
Right? There is a silver lining.
Yeah.
So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to encourage everyone to wash your hands, stay home, stay safe. And should you have some time to be able to look into either Julie's books that are available or the research that's available for Emtrain, we encourage you to do so. It's just part of a very long, ongoing conversation where we're looking to evolve healthy workplace cultures. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a great one. Super. Well, thank you so much, Julie, for sharing all that great. I mean, I could talk to you for hours.
I know. Well, that's a thing.